Once you've selected the vegetables that you would like to grow in your garden, now's the time to really sit down and plan out your garden. This is where those seasonal differences come into play. So we can classify vegetables by when they grow. And we do this by looking at two different major groups, cool season crops and warm season crops. So cool season crops have some specific traits that allow them to grow when the weather is quite cold. Many of them can survive frost down to 24 degrees, especially those plants in the Brassica family. When you seed cool season crops in really warm soil, you may have some issues with germination. But generally, this only occurs if your soil temperatures are well above 85 degrees, 80 to 85 degrees. Seeding in cooler soils works really well for most of these, although germination will always be a little bit slower when the soil is cold. So you need to wait until the soil is workable, and if it's above 40 degrees, that is a good starting point for sowing many of these cool season plants. Some examples of the cool season crops include the perennials, rhubarb and asparagus. All of the plants in the Brassicaceae family can be classified as cool season. Some of the plants in the Apiaceae family, carrots are cool season, although they can be grown during the warm season. They will taste better when they're grown in cooler weather. Lettuce in the Asteraceae family is a cool season crop. Some of the plants in the Fabaceae family are cool season. English peas and sugar snap peas are an example, but most of the plants in the Fabaceae family are warm season. Potato is considered a cool season crop, and typically we plant it very early in the spring, although it will grow during the warmer part of the year and will be harvested in late summer. This is the only cool season crop in the Solanaceae family. The rest of the species in Solanaceae are not frost tolerant at all and are very sensitive to chilling temperatures. The plants in the amaranth family or the Amaranthaceae family, such as beets, Swiss chard, and spinach, are all considered cool season crops as well. They actually will grow and develop very nicely in the spring or in the fall when the temperatures are quite cool, and the flavors of those particular plants will be very enhanced in cool weather as compared to growing them in hot weather. Warm season crops have a commonality in that they cannot tolerate frost at all. Even if it just gets right to that 32-degree mark, they can be killed by a very light frost. When you seed warm season crops in cold soils, typically what happens is the seeds will rot before they ever germinate. Their germination processes just don't work very well until the soil temperatures get well above 50 degrees. And many of the warm season crops would prefer a soil temperature above 70 degrees, but they can tolerate that 50 to 60 degree temperature. So wait until the soil is much warmer before you seed or you transplant. Even if you have tomato plants that are ready to go out into the garden, if the soil is still cold, you can get some stunting of those plants that will take a very long time for the plant to recover, and in some cases it may not recover. So it's really best to wait until the soil is a little bit warmer. So one of the best tools you can have in your garden toolbox is a soil thermometer, because your soil temperatures may be very different from what you see reported on a website or from the local weather station. And in fact, you can have different soil temperatures in your front yard versus your backyard, and certainly if you're growing in raised beds, the temperatures may be very different. So warm season crops include pretty much all of the plants in the Solanaceae family except for potato. And again, potato is one of those strange ones that it'll grow. We plant it really early in the spring and it can tolerate cold weather, but it also will grow pretty well throughout the summer in the heat of the summer until it has more trouble taking up water. When the potatoes die down is generally a good indication that it's time to harvest them. The Cucurbitaceae family is very chilling sensitive, so they are one of our more sensitive groups of warm season plants. Fabaceae, most of the beans and peas are warm season with the exception of the English peas and the sugar snap peas. Sweet corn is very, very cold sensitive, as is sweet potato. Those plants are definitely warm season plants that will appreciate warmer soils as well as warm air temperatures. And as soon as we start to get cold nights and a light frost in the fall, these plants typically will die back. So, where do you live in Wisconsin? If you are in the southern part of the state, you may have frost-free weather as soon as April 26th. If you are in the northern part of state, you may not be so fortunate, and your growing season may be quite a bit shorter. So you may be looking at a month or more later when you could have your potential frost. Your area is very unique, however, and so you have to always consider, microclimate and history in your own particular garden area. And this is where keeping a garden journal may be very helpful for you to record not only those air temperatures at your garden site, but also your soil temperatures. So you have a better idea of what has happened in previous years and perhaps try to predict what will happen in the next year. The first killing frost of the fall is a good date to be aware of as well, because if you're going to calculate your days to harvest, whether or not you're planting cool season or warm season crops, you need to know when to expect that average first frost. And there's quite a bit of variability around the state. If you live closer to the lake side of Wisconsin, you may have a really late first frost. But if you're in the northern reaches of the state, you're going to have a pretty early frost in some years. So you should always be prepared for that. And there are ways to extend the growing season using various types of frost protection mechanisms. But knowing your growing degree day, your growing days, your days to harvest on an average basis will help you plan out which plants you're going to grow and which cultivars. The differences in our frost dates lead to some pretty wide ranges of frost-free days. Frost-free days doesn't necessarily mean growing days. It doesn't mean that the weather's going to be really conducive for growing, but it gives you kind of an idea of the maximum number of days that you might be able to have a garden growing. So if you're in the southern part of the state, it could be 120 to 180 days. 180 days is half a year though, and that's really challenging if you're going to try and garden for 6 months out of the year. It can be done, but it takes a lot of special techniques and knowing your plant types and cultivars very well. In the middle section of the state, the range is more like 110 to 140 frost-free days, and you're in the northern part of the state, 90 to 120 frost-free days are what is typical. One of the techniques that we use in vegetable gardening that can help us make the most out of our growing season and maximize our space is succession planting. And there are a couple of different definitions of succession planting. One of them is to make sure that you have a late season crop planned for after you harvest your early season crop. Another way to define succession planting is when you do multiple plantings of a single crop. So for example, if you're planting bush beans and you plant the first bush beans on Memorial Day, maybe 2 weeks later you plant another row of bush beans, and 2 weeks after that you plant another row of bush beans. That way you will have successive harvest times for those beans and be able to spread out the harvest over a longer period of time. You can also plant different cultivars with different maturity dates as a way of doing succession planting. So you are maximizing not only your space but your time relative to planting and harvesting. An example of a spring early season crop would be radish. And there are many different cultivars of radish, so you need to look at the days to harvest very carefully. But radish is one of those great in-between crops for spring and fall that has um, a short season. And so you can find cultivars of radish with as few as 21 days to harvest. But not all radishes are that short, so make sure that you're looking at that very carefully. Beans are a warm season crop that generally is grown in the summer, but there are a lot of different kinds of beans. So you might have a bush bean that has a very short season of 40 to 50 days, but you may also have a pole bean that has a very long season of anywhere from 70 to 110 days. So you could have bean production for a much longer period of time, but they will be taking up that space in your garden for pretty much the entire growing season. Fall growing plants include things like carrots. And again, look at the days to harvest very carefully. If you are planting a fall crop of carrots, don't choose one of the cultivars that takes 90 to 100 days to mature. Look for one of the Nantes or Chantenay types that has a little bit shorter growing time so that you know that they will mature in time for you to harvest in the fall when they're when they're their flavor and their sweetness will be at the maximum. So this is an example of three different plants that you can plant in the same space. 21 days harvest, then plant the beans during the summer for 52 days and then harvest those beans, and then the carrots can be planted right after that in the fall. If you're looking for a little bit of a shorter time, you can include things like lettuce in the spring. The romaine lettuce is very cold tolerant and will germinate nicely in the cool soil, followed by sun gold tomato. Tomato's a little bit tricky when you're looking at the days to harvest, however, so that would be from the time that you put the plants in the ground, not from the time of seed. So you would have the plants growing somewhere else and ready to go in the ground as soon as you harvested the romaine lettuce. So when you add those two, you end up with a total growing time in your garden space of 113 days. Another example of succession planting can be seen with the early planting of sugar snap peas, followed by another vine, which is definitely a warm season plant, of watermelon. So the peas you would be harvesting at about the time that the watermelon would be ready to be planted. And in this case, the 79 days is a very short season watermelon with respect to other watermelons. And so that's a very important characteristic to look at. Melons in some cases take 110 to 120 days to mature. So for most of Wisconsin, it's a great idea to look for a melon that matures in the shortest number of days possible. In this example of peas followed by watermelon, we would need a total growing season of 141 days. Another technique used in vegetable gardens is intercropping. One of my favorite examples of doing this is planting radishes and carrots together. The reason that I do this in my garden is that the radishes and carrots are both cool season crops. The radish that I use typically will mature in about 21 days. Carrot seeds take, in some cases, 3 weeks to germinate. And so by the time you are harvesting your radishes, the carrot seedlings are just starting to come up. So it's a great time to harvest your radishes, thin your carrot seedlings at the same time, and then the carrots have plenty of room to grow once the radishes have been harvested. Another example is what's commonly known as the Three Sisters Garden. The Three Sisters Garden is a planting technique used by Native Americans, both in this country as well as in Central and South America. And in the intercropping method of the Three Sisters, corn is grown both for the kernel production as well as a support system for a pole bean. So the pole beans grow up the corn stalk, And then underneath, a usually a winter type squash or a pumpkin, a vining type of squash is grown around the corn, which helps to provide shade for the soil. It helps to keep weeds down around the corn, and it gives a nice three crop planting with very little maintenance involved. In the traditional intercropped corn, beans, and squash, the corn that is used is either a dent type or a popcorn corn, but you could use sweet corn in this particular example if you wanted to do that. Crop rotation is recommended in all types of garden situations, and there are so many different reasons for doing it. So even if you're growing in a raised bed or a small garden area, it's really a good idea to try and rotate your crops on a at least every 4 years kind of a rotation. Crop rotation is based on plant family, not plant type. And so the benefits of rotating through the different plant families are that you don't give the pests, the diseases, the weeds, the insects, you don't give them a chance to build up in the soil. In addition, each plant family has very distinct differences in the way that they use nutrients out of the soil, or in the case of the beans, in the way they put nutrients back in the soil. So it's a great idea to rotate through those plant families and try to move things around in your garden as much as possible. The example here is to go from broccoli to tomato, carrot, cucumber, and then back to peas and beans. In some garden situations, you might not be able to do that, but if you can at least rotate between a bean crop and some other plant family, it's very helpful.